Just imagine a courtroom in Rome. The year is 897. The air is heavy, thick with incense and, well, the unmistakable smell of decay. On a grand throne sits the defendant, dressed in the full, magnificent robes of a pope. But he's not saying anything. He's not moving. His face is blackened, his limbs stiff, because he's been dead for 9 months. And no, that's not a figure of speech. This is a literal corpse on trial. And as one writer at the time put it, it was a truly horrifying sight.
Believe it or not, what you just pictured was a real historical event. It's known as the Cadaver Synod, or, if you want the more dramatic Latin name, the Synodus Horrenda, the Terrible Synod. It is, without a doubt, one of the most bizarre and grotesque episodes in the entire history of the papacy. So, who were the main players in this macabre little show?
Well, the judge, who was also acting as the prosecutor, was the guy who was pope at the time, Stephen VI. And the defendant, propped up on that throne, was the 9-month dead body of the pope who came before him, Pope Formosus. But what could a man possibly do in life to make someone hate him so much that they'd dig him up just to put him on trial? To get to the bottom of that, we first have to understand the man himself.
Pope Formosus, whose name, and you gotta love the irony here, means handsome or well-formed, had a career that was just full of incredible success and, well, really intense conflict. He was pope from 891 to 896, but his story goes back way further. He started out as this super successful missionary, getting all kinds of praise for his work in Bulgaria. But that ambition, it was going to make him some very, very powerful enemies.
Yeah, the trouble for Formosus kicked off pretty early. The Pope at the time, John VIII, saw Formosus's ambition as a direct threat. So he hit him with a whole list of serious charges: violating church law, trying to steal the papacy, even conspiracy. And the result? In 876, Formosus was excommunicated, basically kicked out of the church entirely.
But a guy like Formosus, his story doesn't just end there. Another pope, Marinus I, eventually pardoned him and let him back in as a bishop. And once his enemies were out of the picture, Formosus finally got what he always wanted. In 891, he was elected pope. But when he reached the very top, he didn't exactly find peace. Nope. He found himself smack dab in the middle of a brutal political firestorm. Which, of course, brings us back to our big mystery. A trial for a dead guy digging up his body. It just seems insane, right? This wasn't just about some old grudges from his excommunication. No, the real motive was way more cynical and had everything to do with the dirty, violent politics of 9th century Italy. So what was the real reason for this ghoulish spectacle?
Okay, so here's the most important thing you have to understand. The Cadaver Synod had almost nothing to do with religion. It was pure cutthroat politics. See, back then, the papacy wasn't just a spiritual job. It was a political prize. The Pope had the power to crown emperors, and there were 2 powerful families locked in a battle, basically a real-life Game of Thrones, for control of the Holy Roman Empire. On one side, you had the Italian Spoleto dynasty, led by Emperor Guy III and his son Lambert. They were the local power brokers. And on the other side, you had Arnulf of Carinthia, who was from the old Carolingian line, representing German influence. Both of them wanted that imperial crown, and the Pope was the one who could hand it out. Formosus was caught right in the middle of it all. And this is where Formosus made his fatal mistake. At first, he was under a ton of pressure from the Spoleto family, who pretty much ran Rome. So in 892, he crowned Guy's son Lambert as co-emperor, but he really didn't trust these guys. So in a shocking move, he secretly reached out to their #1 rival, Arnulf, and invited him to come invade Italy. By 896, Arnulf's army was in Rome, and Formosus did the unthinkable. He crowned Arnulf the new Holy Roman Emperor, kicking Lambert to the curb. He had picked a side, and in doing so, he had basically signed his own death warrant, and, as it turns out, his own post-death warrant too. But wait. The story gets even crazier. Right after being crowned, Emperor Arnulf had a stroke and had to pull his army out of Italy. Then, just a few weeks later, Pope Formosus himself dies. Suddenly, they're both gone. A huge power vacuum opens up, and the Spoleto family, who are furious and looking for revenge, immediately seize control of Rome again. And their first order of business? Put their own guy on the papal throne, a loyal puppet named Stephen VI.
So why on earth would Stephen VI agree to this horrifying plan? Well, a few key reasons. First off, he owed the Spoleto family. They put him in power, and they wanted payback. Second, and this is the big one, if he could prove Formosus was never a legitimate pope, then everything Formosus did, including crowning their rival Arnulf as emperor, would be totally null and void. Third, it's a classic case of damnatio memoriae, the old Roman practice of trying to literally erase someone from history. And finally, Stephen was trying to shore up his own shaky claim to the papacy. The corpse of Formosus was the perfect political pawn.
So with all that political drama in mind, let's go back to that horrific courtroom. This was never going to be a real trial. It was a carefully staged show, a piece of political theater designed to reach one and only one conclusion. You have to picture this. Pope Stephen VI is presiding, and he's reportedly just screaming accusations at this silent, decaying corpse, demanding answers it obviously couldn't give. And just to pretend like this was all legitimate, they appointed a young deacon to defend the dead pope. This poor kid was forced to stand next to a rotting body and just tremble his way through some weak, pre-written defense. And the official charges? Well, they weren't exactly new. They just dusted off the same old accusations that Pope John VIII had used against Formosus years before. He was unworthy. He illegally switched jobs. He broke an old oath. He acted as a bishop when he wasn't supposed to. It was all just a legal smokescreen for a political hit job.
Of course, the verdict was never in doubt. I mean, come on. With the terrified deacon offering no real defense and Stephen running the whole show, Formosus was found guilty on every single charge. He was declared an impostor, never a true pope. But the verdict? That was only the beginning. The punishment that came next would descend into pure horror. The desecration was systematic, and it was symbolic. First, they ripped the holy papal robes right off the corpse for everyone to see. Then someone stepped forward and hacked off the 3 fingers of Formosus's right hand, the very fingers he used to give blessings. With that one act, they were symbolically canceling out every sacred thing he had ever done. Then, all of his acts as pope were officially declared void. And for the final insult, his mutilated body was dragged out and dumped into the Tiber River.
So Stephen VI and the Spoleto family got their victory, but it was an incredibly short-lived one, because this grotesque spectacle didn't make them look powerful. It horrified the people of Rome. The sheer blasphemy of it all, digging up and mutilating a pope's body, sparked massive outrage. It backfired. Big time. And this is where the story takes another really weird turn. Legend says that the body of Formosus didn't just sink to the bottom of the river. It washed ashore, and rumors started spreading like wildfire that fishermen had found the body and it had started performing miracles, healing the sick. Now, whether that's true or not, it didn't matter. In the public's mind, Formosus was transformed from a criminal into a holy martyr, and Pope Stephen was no longer a judge, he was a monster. I mean, this whole era was just absolute chaos. Just look at the turnover. Formosus dies, his successor lasts just 2 weeks. Then Stephen VI takes over, holds the trial, and is dead himself in about a year. His successor, Theodore II, rules for only 20 days. The papacy wasn't just unstable, it was a deadly revolving door of intrigue and violence. The public anger against Stephen VI just boiled over. A mob rose up in the summer of 897. Stephen was overthrown, arrested, and thrown into a dungeon, where he was strangled to death, a violent end for a violent man. His successor, Theodore II, even though he was only pope for a few weeks, immediately tried to undo the damage. He officially declared the Cadaver Synod void, had Formosus's body recovered from the river, and gave it a full, honorable reburial in St. Peter's Basilica. So, after all that, you might be thinking, okay, that's a wild story, but why are we still talking about it today? Because the Cadaver Synod wasn't just some weird historical footnote. It sent shockwaves through the church that had some really big, lasting consequences. Historians see this trial as the absolute lowest point of a period they call the Saeculum Obscurum, or the Dark Age of the papacy. This was a time when the spiritual authority of the Pope was basically hijacked by the political games of feuding Roman families. The Cadaver Synod became the ultimate, most infamous symbol of all that corruption. The fallout from this whole mess led to some very real changes. To make sure a disgrace like this could never happen again, a new church law was passed that flat out forbids putting a dead person on trial. The scandal was so huge that it became a rallying cry for reformers hundreds of years later who wanted to clean up the church. And, in a small but very telling sign of just how infamous this event was, in over 1,000 years since, no pope has ever dared to take the name Formosus again. Ultimately, this story of the Cadaver Synod is just a brutal lesson in what happens when power,
politics, and faith all crush into each other. It leaves us with a tough question that people are still debating today. When the immense power of an institution clashes with the sacredness of belief, which one usually ends up winning? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into history. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, do us a favor and hit that like button, and subscribe to the channel for more. We'll see you next time.